Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to DAG. It's a pleasure to have on my left Amitabh Kant and on my far left Timothy Curtis. Tim is the director of UNESCO in India and a representative for most SAARC country nations. And he brings that aspect of defining what creates heritage cities around the world. Amitabh Kant, of course, needs no introduction as the G20 Sherpa, former CEO of NITI Aayog, and of course, close associations with lots of ministries and departments, including the Ministry of Tourism, where, of course, he's acknowledged for doing some groundbreaking work. We're delighted to have this conversation against the backdrop of our exhibition, Banaras Imagined Landscape. The exhibition has been put together as a collective visualization of what the city has represented for artists ever since the late 18th century, when William Hodges, the Daniels, etc., first came in and painted the landscape of what the city looked like, opening the doors for other artists who followed, Orientalists who came in from around the world, Indian artists who followed, all of whom described their own idea of what the city looked like. It's a city which, of course, has a great sense of history, a great past, and that is what, in a sense, we will be discussing, because it's not the art we are discussing this evening, but talking about Banaras from the perspectives of the past, its present, and, of course, the future. So to kind of kickstart this conversation, I'm going to just read some quotes on the city by eminent artists before we run with the discussion with these two gentlemen. So, historically, we know that Banaras has been occupied since the 4th century AD or Christian era. But there are descriptions of it going back to further Puranic times, etc. And in his travels in India, the first painter of Banaras, William Hodges, who I've already mentioned, said that Banaras to him was the great variety of the buildings, strikes the eye, and the whole view is much improved by innumerable flights of stone steps, which are either entrances into the several temples or to the houses. An American writer, Mark Twain, who's been quoted very, very often about his travels to and impressions of Banaras, wrote about it. Banaras is older than history, older than tradition, older even than legend, and looks twice as old as all of them put together, which might well be said of India as well. However, Gayatri Sinha, who has curated this exhibition, points out that modern historians write of the lack of archaeological evidence to prove the antiquity of the city's past and its wanted mythic status. Historians have analyzed what the making of the imagined city has entailed and challenged the reading of a mythic past in the city's existing material heritage. And she quotes several historians, of course, to make that point. Nevertheless, for Diana Eck, who wrote that seminal book, City of Light, she writes of it like this: the city illumines truth and reveals reality. It does not bring new wonders into the scope of vision, but enables one to see what is already there. Where this eternal light intersects the earth, it is known as Kashi, literally the city of light. And finally, I quote the German philosopher Count Hermann Kesseling, who says, Banaras is holy. Europe, grown superficial, hardly understands such truths anymore. I feel nearer here than I have ever done to the heart of the world. Here I feel every day as if soon, perhaps even today, I would receive the grace of supreme revelation. The atmosphere of devotion which hangs above the river is improbable in strength, stronger than any church that I have ever visited. Every would-be Christian priest would do well to sacrifice a year of his theological studies in order to spend his time on the Ganges. Here, he would discover what piety means. So, I think the readings and writings are immense. They're very, very complex. They uncover layers of the city, pretty much the same way that artists photographers, sculptors, etc., have shown us various visualizations of what makes the city, etc. There is, of course, the artistic heritage that we have, but there are so many other dimensions in terms of Banaras itself, which I hope we'll explore as this evening progresses. But to kickstart the conversation, any opening remarks, Amitabh?
Well, Kishore, I'm largely here because, Banaras is the city where I was born. My mother was a professor in Banaras Hindu University. My father was a judge there. And I have very fond memories of my childhood there. And so I thought there's nothing better than coming to this exhibition. I mean, I want to really compliment DAG first and Gayatri Sinha for this truly remarkable exhibition on Banaras, and to have got so many masters of the colonial period, and to get so many Indian masters together who've painted on Banaras and done such a phenomenal job. Because to my mind, Banaras is really the fountainhead of Indian civilization, and it's the only city in the world which presents the temporal with the eternal, and really the mundane with the divine. There's no other city in the world which does this so powerfully. And there's no other city in the world where the Ghats present the continuous cycle of being born, living, and then dying, and then giving rebirth. And that is the great philosophy of Hinduism. And to my mind, the challenge really is for the world, and that's a challenge for heritage. And I would like Mr. Curtis to comment on this, because the challenge is a city. This is a city of soul. It's a city of great, cultural, elevation, and a great mental rejuvenation and spiritual invigoration. How do you retain this in an age of modernity? And how do you blend the contemporary with such great heritage, and without tampering with the cultural and spiritual significance of the city? Because today you have vast number of Vande Bharats running to Banaras. You have a huge number of flights. You have the roads being done up. You have bridges being made. These are contemporary necessities for modern living. But how do you ensure that the soul of the city remains intact? How do you ensure that it remains a city which will invigorate those living there and those who visit that place? And how do you ensure that people continue to get spiritually invigorated? How do you ensure that the character of the city, in terms of its art, its culture, its history, its great cuisine, remains to continuously liven the souls of those traveling to Varanasi or Banaras? And that, to my mind, is the real challenge of modern day era. The blend of tradition with modernity, the blend of heritage with contemporary infrastructure building is the real challenge of today. And that, to my mind, is very, very significant. Many cities have been ravaged, many cities have been destroyed. But to my mind, this is, as the fountainhead of Indian civilization, continues to inspire, continues to motivate, and continues to, invigorate a whole lot of Indians and travelers. I've never seen a tourist ever come back dissatisfied with the experience of Banaras. All my life, I've met people who've come back and said they've been completely invigorated or rejuvenated with the experience of Banaras, and that must continuously remain so.
Thank you. Tim, opening remarks from you.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me here. And I must say, and as you know, I was a little bit intimidated to be invited here because I don't really know that much about Banaras except what I've read. And the more I've looked into it, I must say Banaras is now on the tentative list for World Heritage nomination for UNESCO. Sorry. And I was looking into the criteria, and I just want to pick up on the questions that were raised by Mr. Kant, which I think are actually at the heart of the matter. How do you keep what we call the living heritage alive? Not just the buildings, not just the sites, but that essence and that soul. And I think Banaras is going to be a challenge. And I think we've seen a lot of places get turned into sort of, let's say, living museums. And I think that's the danger, as well as the dangers of rapid development. I've spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia. A lot of heritage is destroyed by rapid economic development and then a bit regretfully later. And I think Banaras and other places in India have the chance to actually think about it. So hopefully we'll discuss about that. And I'll just looking at the criteria that's been put up for the World Heritage Inscription, I think it covers there's three main criteria which are being put forward. And they are a testimony to a civilization, either continued or past. That's a criteria I think we heard you speak about. The other is the architectural significance. And for Varanasi, it's the Ghats that give it that outstanding global universal value. And then the third criteria being put forward is what we call criteria 6, the living heritage and the intangible cultural heritage, which is very much, I think, at the heart of what we're discussing here. And then perhaps we'll go into these issues of what kinds of example. I would just preface it by saying there's no one size fits all, that the solutions to this will have to be from those who really know and love the city and engage with it, because what works for one city or one place may not be exactly what is needed for another. And each place, each World Heritage Site in this case, really is unique. But I think there are examples that people can learn from, and I think that's the point of the World Heritage Convention, is you can see what has worked and what hasn't worked, and sharing that internationally and engaging with that to address precisely those challenges, which I think are the core challenges you've pointed out. Yeah.
So the issues that we have to reconcile is the whole idea of a heritage city and a smart city, the two elements that we're trying to bring together. And in Banaras, they are, of course, that much more significant because the great history that we have, the sacred history, and various other elements that have shaped that history over there. Quickly, would you share how a heritage city is nominated and picked for the audience?
Okay, for the World Heritage list, I'll try not to get too technical and try to go quickly. It's basically an international treaty, a convention, which is I think it's the most ratified UN treaty of all. It has 190 now countries. So it's almost all UN countries have signed this World Heritage Convention. And the philosophy behind the convention is that certain sites are of outstanding universal value, that they are of value to the whole of humanity. And so a country, when submitting a site for the list, must demonstrate certain criteria that it has outstanding universal value, that this site is indeed of value has outstanding universal value, without going into the details of how that. But that's why I've mentioned those criteria. There's a sets of criteria that are agreed upon, which include, and then the philosophy is essentially the country is taking a commitment to the international community to protect that site, and at the same time, and I don't think it's the case here, it's not the case, but in other countries, the international community also commits to assisting the country when needed to protect the site. So that's the philosophy. So it goes through an evaluation, it goes through a rigorous ICOMOS, the International Council of Museums, or for natural sites, IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature, send expert missions. A report is drafted. There's several site visits. These then go to an intergovernmental committee of 21 countries. They rotate on that committee who inscribe. So that's the process. So from the time it's sent to UNESCO, usually takes a couple of years, and then there's a lot of work before. So they will be checking, for example, do you have the management plan in place? Are the laws in place? Is the legal infrastructure to protect those attributes which are deemed outstanding universal value? So it's a long process, yeah.
Yes, indeed. And, I mean, through heritage sites, etc., we know that there's a constant monitoring committee, etc., that is constantly checking that there are no violations of rules that take place within a heritage zone. Amitabh, what I'd really like to understand is we have this sense of architecture that comes up on the riverfront ghats, etc. And since you talk about spending a part of your childhood in Banaras and seeing the way Banaras was, let's say those several decades ago, to now, before the restorations on the ghats began, and then in terms of the restoration on the ghats and the temple heritage corridor that has been created. What are the changes that you've seen, and how do those changes impact the Banaras that we've known?
Well, last time I went there, I went to the Manikarnika Ghat and the Harishchandra Ghat, and both had been remarkably well done. They'd been done very aesthetically, and the architectural work was very fine, and so was the temple. Because what had happened over the years is that a lot of encroachments had come up over a period of time, and so families grew. And as families grew, and these were families of Pandas, and as they grew and expanded, they kept creating small little temples over the years. And around the Vishwanath temple, you had a lot of other temples coming up, small areas. And these were actually houses under which, as a part of the house, they had created small temples. But the remarkable thing that had been done by the district administration and the temple administration was to work in partnership with all the landowners, and actually alternative sites and alternative good compensation was given to them. And that area has been beautifully designed and linked to the ghats. So you can access the temple now with the ghat. But Banaras is a great city of temples. I mean, it has some of the most remarkable temples. It has the Hanuman temple, it has the Vishwanath temple, it has the Birla temple, it has a temple where you start your visit to Banaras, which is known as the Kotwal of Banaras. If you have to first visit that, take his permission, and then go to the other temples. That's remarkable. And that's a small little temple in a small gully, but it's a remarkable temple. And, and the second thing is about Banaras is that it's a city of, which should rightly be a great civilizational city simply because of the great educational institution that is. Sanskrit evolved as a language from there. Hindi evolved as a language from there. There's a great Sanskrit Vidyapeeth there.
That's right.
And there is a great Buddhist teaching institute which is supported by the Culture Ministry. So all the Buddhism has actually grown from Banaras, and of course Hinduism, all that. But I think to my mind, the greatest thing I find about Banaras is it's not merely the spiritual invigoration, there's some very remarkable museums. The Banaras Hindu University has a very remarkable museum which needs to be seen. And there's a very remarkable work on the ghats of Banaras. There's a very nice educational foundation which the Nyotia's family, Mr. Harsh Nyotia's aunt has maintained, and which is the best place to actually stay in. From there you get a complete view of the ghats, and you get a complete view of the Ganges from there. So that's a private sector initiative. And to my mind, the greatest thing about Banaras is its lassi. It's no cuisine in the world can match the lassi of Banaras in a kullad, and it's just phenomenal. And the Banaras chaat, which is very different from anything that you'll get anywhere else in the world. So it's remarkable cuisine. It should be a UNESCO city simply on the merit of its great cuisine.
What you say, and really, in a sense, to try and understand what is happening in Banaras, we talk about the conservation of architectural heritage by and large, but we tend not to take note of so much else over there. So I don't think how many in the audience would even know that Banaras actually was a royal kingdom as well, not simply a sacred city. With its own gharanas of Kathak, of tabla, great, sense of performing arts vis-a-vis, let's say, the Ramayana on the ghats of the Ganga, which has been enacted year after year on several occasions, etc. Then you have the whole sense of, you talked about food, the cultural nuances. There is, other than the lassi, there's the pan, etc., etc. So there's all of that. There's also that sense of culture, of indolence, almost, as a cultural nuance within society itself.
Kishore, many people don't know this, but one of the cricket teams of India was captained by Vizzy, the Maharaja of Vijayanagaram.
That's right.
And Vizzy was actually later became a great cricket commentator. So when I was growing up in school, he was a very distinguished cricket commentator at that time, coming from Banaras, and he captained the Indian cricket team which went to England.
Absolutely. And you've had people like Bismillah Khan, etc., who've been associated with the musical performances.
So every gully, and these are small gullies actually, these are, one of the challenges of Banaras has been that you have small gullies. Because it's the fountainhead of Indian civilization, small gullies, and every gully has a great maestro living there. So all the great Indian musicians, starting from Ravi Shankar, have actually learned from the gharanas of Banaras.
So how do we then preserve and restore this facet of material culture in a place like Banaras, where I think largely the concentration so far seems to have been purely on architecture? How do we include the fact that we need to recognize these maestros, we need to reinvigorate these nuances of the city? Is there a way, is there a template that has been created? I mean, I'd like to hear from both of you.
So, I've had a close look at this UNESCO inscription, and pardon my saying this, but it has huge Western biases. There's a very poor understanding of other civilizations and the huge amount of heritage in terms of India's past history or in terms of its tradition and culture. And my belief is that the key about Banaras is its differentiation as a city from the rest of the world. I've traveled all over the world, and I don't think even Rome can match the history, the culture, the traditions. And to be able to comprehend that, you have to understand the difference between the temporal world and the eternal world. And until you don't get into the basic philosophy of Hinduism and to understand what is divine in the concept of Hinduism, it'll be very difficult for the UNESCO experts to understand the civilizational strength of Banaras.
So how do we make that happen,
I think I hear very much what's being said, and I may surprise you by not really disagreeing, but I'll come back with the thing. First of all, Banaras has already been recognized as a UNESCO Creative City of Music. That was in 2015, and so you have to understand the World Heritage Convention was drafted in 1972, and it is very focused on the architectural sites. There's a new convention that came up in 2003 called the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention, the Living Heritage Convention, which is precisely was following debates about expanding the notion of cultural heritage beyond just buildings to all of these living traditions that people have. And that's this famous criteria. 6 in this nomination is supposed to reflect it. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter what the UNESCO Convention has. I think that's going to be focused in the World Heritage, that specific convention, on the architectural integrity of the site and the architectural site. But it misses exactly how it said, all of these really deep living traditions. So it's up to the city. There's nothing to stop it to actually make sure, for example, that as you do tourism development plans, watch out that the street food is still there, that the local community, or one of the problems we've seen in a number of World Heritage sites is gentrification. As tourism comes, local communities are forced to move out because they can no longer afford. I'll give an example, a country I know, Luang Prabang in Laos. It's a Buddhist site with temples, is on the World Heritage. And as it grew in tourism, the monks depended on people coming to feed them. But of course, the local people had to move out because the value of the real estate went up, and then there's nobody to come and feed the monks, and then the monks can't come. And so all of these things are interconnected. So the point about the management plan is not, but you must keep that archaeological or that architectural integrity. That's really key, because if that's gone, actually all sorts of other reverberations happen. So that is part of it, but it's not the whole story, and it's not enough. So having a really what we call an integrated management plan, bringing in creative industries, bringing in this living heritage aspect, bringing in with the heritage conservation and the tourism management, and thinking about things like gentrification and what the ramifications of those might be, and having local policies to actually counter and adapt and support, so that you don't you keep that local food, you keep the music going as part of the overall management. I think that's the approach that's happened. And we don't have to stick to the rigidity of what was thought as in 1972 as the height. We've all evolved since then in our understanding of cultural heritage conservation. And, so that's my response on that level.
So through this idea of regeneration and restoration that we have, is there fear that in trying to create a model, you actually displace local residents and populations and therefore render a space sterile, which would be tragic in a place like Banaras? That's one. And the other, tourism is wonderful. It is great. But here, does it become a savior, or does it put the destination in a place of crisis, as we've seen happening around the world today?
So I'll come to both of those. I would say, yes, both of those are threats. And the first of all is heritage, particularly living heritage. The worst you can do is try to freeze it and to say it's stuck. And you stick it as an idea of a time, and then it's no longer living, it's a museum thing. And that's, in my opinion, a disaster. That's okay for very ancient archaeological sites have disappeared, so that you want to know the history, but it's not okay for cities, historic centers, and living traditions. And secondly, tourism it can be a huge help. Many heritage cities and sites can survive precisely because there's revenue generation through tourism. But if it's not managed properly and if it's not thought out properly, it can also be a devastation, and it can completely destroy the soul of a place. So both of those are possible. It depends on the kinds of policy choices and the community involvement and all these things that are involved. And it can be hugely beneficial, but it needs to be understood, and it needs certain safeguards need to be put there.
Do you think it could also, that could upset, tourism could upset the tempo of life as we understand it in Banaras, this whole idea of the ghats and the idea of mortality, immortality, life and death, etc., this whole theater of life that we see over there. Do you feel it might be impacted by too sterile a model of tourism generation and restoration?
So to my mind, we shouldn't worry too much about UNESCO inscription. And for us, the important thing should be to retain the unique soft power and the civilizational aspect of Varanasi. And the UNESCO inscription will happen automatically, to my mind. And if it doesn't happen, then UNESCO will be the loser, to my mind. Because there's no city which has such immense soft power in terms of the Banarasi saris and its handlooms and its toy industry. And to my mind, I've seen cities which would get a UNESCO inscription just on the basis of one aspect of Banaras, which is just Sarnath. Forget the rest of the city, forget the ghats, forget the temples, forget everything else. Just on the basis of Sarnath, Varanasi, to my mind, be a UNESCO inscribed city. Because that Sarnath itself is a great, unique destination in terms of Buddhism. But in totality of Banaras, in terms of its spirituality, in terms of its ghats, in terms of its temple, in terms of its educational institutions and all that, I've traveled all over and I've been to all the UNESCO cities. I don't think there's any city like Varanasi, to my mind. And the remarkable feature of Varanasi is that it's one city in India which has managed to retain its traditional character. And that essence of Varanasi in terms of the divinity of Hinduism and your ability to rediscover yourself when you visit Varanasi again and again and again and come back as a rejuvenated human being doesn't exist in any city of the world.
So in that sense, we've just seen the very successful conclusion of Kumbh, for example. Does the fact that Kumbh largely happens by itself, of course there has to be the entire administrative support that creates the platforms for people to come and visit and stay in those huge numbers that we talk about, 40 crores, 400 million visitors over a short span of time. Like Kumbh, does Banaras have its own rhythms and pace that will carry on no matter what happens?
To my mind, Banaras is timeless. It's a continuous process of having birth, going through the life, death, and then again rebirth. That's a continuous cycle of Banaras, and you achieve moksha only if you're buried on the ghats of Banaras. So that's the timeless essence of Banaras. Mahakumbh happens because there is a constellation of stars happening 12 years. In this particular year, it was 144 years at that particular point where Ganga, Yamuna, and Saraswati converge and integrate. So that happens once in 12 years or once in 144 years as this happened. And therefore, there's an ascendancy of people from all over the world into that place. And you create a city temporary city of over 55 crore people for a short span of time. But Banaras is timeless.
It just carries on. Kind of related to this, Amitabh, I'd like to ask, now we're talking about heritage and conservation and regeneration and restoration at so many levels, etc. And the government does one part, but there are other players who have to come in and also take part in some of these programs or activities. How do the public and the private sectors kind of assimilate or create opportunities over here?
Well, I'll just pick up on saying that I kind of have no doubt that once it goes through the process, it'll become a World Heritage Site. And I agree, it has all those attributes. It's just a question of, in a way, the paperwork and getting that done. But coming back to your question, and I think what we've seen a lot, and this is even more important for cities, living cities that are heritage sites, is the central role of the community inhabitants. That community must be connected to the historic city, and they must be fully integrated, both private sector, government, and everything. But you cannot have outside institutions come out and impose it on a heritage community, and particularly for these cities, and we could list them, but that is the key. So private sector has a role to play. That means the tourism operators, that means the food industry, the music industry, the performing arts industry, but it must be integrating the actual inhabitants of the community living in or around the site. Because before there was the state, before there was UNESCO, these sites managed themselves for centuries. And it was through that transmission and practice of those communities, and that's the center of it. That doesn't mean it can't change. It doesn't mean it can't evolve, but it must be within that context. So let's say a city in India that's the World Heritage Site, Ahmedabad, the historic center of Ahmedabad. That is also facing lots of challenges with pressures of development. It's a big city, but it's very important that the community organizations are at the center of these things, are engaged with the support and the engagement of course, local government and, of course, heritage expertise and private sector. What do you mean by private sector? Do we mean the local businesses? Do you mean big businesses coming in and opening and wanting to build things? There has to be some regulations, there has to be laws, and there has to be that dialogue that goes on. That's been my answer to that.
So my view is that the private sector has to play a very critical and significant role, and my view always has been that it's the experiences around Varanasi, and every time I've gone to Varanasi, I've wondered as to why we've not been able to create a unique experience of the great weaving that is done, and where you can get all the top-class designer products in Varanasi itself. I mean, all the karigars do work for Sabyasachi or for Manish Malhotra or for Rahul Mishra or for Tarun Teheliani, and you get them here in their outlets here. But if you were to go to Banaras, there's nobody who's been able to create a brilliant experience of the great work being done by the karigars there, so that they themselves derive a much greater earning. I've wondered as to why nobody has been able to create a great experience of some of the greatest wooden toys that are created. I mean, the wooden toys are just beautiful there. It's a great heritage product, but nobody has been able to create an experience around that. And nobody from the private sector till date has been able to create a great culinary experience in the heart of Banaras where tourists can go and experience it. There's no point going to a 5-star hotel like Taj and experiencing Varanasi cuisine, Banaras cuisine, but it should be more accessible to any tourist going there. I mean, every time I've gone to this at Lanka next to BHU. There's a great guy who makes lassi, or at the Hanuman Mandir. But there's no place where you can experience the whole of. You can get a complete experience of cuisine, of the karigars, a live demonstration, and where you can get to purchase the toys and the saris of Banaras all together. And that's a holistic experience which needs to be created by the private sector of India. And,
No, I second that. In fact, that is pretty much what my question was, that this has not been done despite the number of tourists coming into the city and from around the world. I think the idea is just to come in and experience the riverfront and go back. Even the spiritual experience has not really been tapped into with any degree of depth anywhere. Certainly no, I mean, there should be global musical festivals that should take place. Again, they've not been looked at in any way. The great carpet weaving centers are close by. We haven't done anything to attract those segments over there, etc. So how do we kickstart this? How do we make this happen?
Okay, sure. One of the great things that's happened is the Aarti on the Ghats of Banaras. And
That's right.
That's a unique experience. We did this during G20 in Varanasi, and we hosted about 220 meetings in over 100 cities of India. But the people who went to Varanasi, most of them were foreign ministers of India, they all came back saying that was a heavenly experience for them. I mean, they all said that was the best experience they've ever had in their life, an Aarti on the Ghats of Varanasi. So that was unique.
Yeah, I mean, we've had, and I quoted one of these writers saying that the strength of spirituality in Banaras is palpable. But to your mind, since Amitabh says there has been no other city that he has personally experienced, which represents, of course, here the soul of India, but this entire experience as a sacred city of spirituality, where would you find equivalents of a Banaras from places around the world? And I'm not saying direct parallels, but in terms of experience, also in terms of how those destinations might have been regenerated.
Yeah, I think we have in the UNESCO panoply a list of World Heritage Sites that have deep spiritual significance to those who visit. Vatican is a World Heritage Site. A couple of months ago, I was in Nepal in Lumbini, the birthplace of the Lord Buddha, where people are coming from Southeast Asia and there's these tensions, but they're not quite the same because they're not really there's not also this historic center. So you have this sort of complexity here of a historic living city, which of this there are many like Venice and so on, where people are living and this thing, but you also have the spiritual side and the kind of quote unquote pilgrimage side, and also people coming there for the most profound moment of life, which is the end of life, and so these are things that are really quite unique. So you're going to find some sites where people are going for spiritual reasons. How does that manage? You have to balance, the conservation of the site with the access. So we've had some. I'll come back to Lumbini. A bit of an issue going on there because the archaeologists want to preserve the archaeology, and of course people want to go and worship, and there's tensions between access to the archaeology and more and more people are going there. The Vatican is very controlled through an institution that controls it, but it's also a deeply spiritual place for those who go there. But then you have these cities. Venice is a good example. Venice, the city of Venice, which is an architectural city, a city of water, also a little bit like that, but which has a huge tourism issue, and the local population being able to sustain itself within the massive amounts of tourism. So I don't see one city fitting Varanasi or Banaras. I think it's looking at these different dimensions. It is unique. It does have both that spiritual sense that destination sense for tourism, but also for people going for spiritual reasons. But it's also a city where people are living and grow up and live and have their lives to do. So it brings all of those together. So I don't know if that answers you.
Well, living heritage is always something that is, there is a very sensitive issue to kind of cope with. Fortunately, I mean, Banaras, because the sheer numbers of people, etc., I don't think you have a sense of being overwhelmed or swamped over there the way you might in a Jaisalmer or in smaller destinations, perhaps. And that certainly has been happening in Europe.
So I've traveled to Venice quite often, and I'd say that Venice is too small compared to Varanasi. And I think it lacks the civilizational strength and the historical context which Varanasi has. And it lacks the aspects of spirituality which Varanasi has. Probably, to my mind, the only city in totality which can be compared to Varanasi in the world is, in terms of heritage, is Rome. Rome. Yeah. There's no other city in the world which has a similar kind of impact other than Rome, to my mind, in the world.
No, I would tend to agree. I think Rome has that sensibility. Venice, yes, attracts a certain kind of people. And, over the centuries, has kind of invited travelers, but also artists. So I think a great equivalence in terms of Venice that has been painted and photographed so much over a period of time would have its equivalence, at least in India, certainly in Banaras somewhere. One last question before we open it up to the audience, Amitabh. We have this great sense of ennui in terms of how our cities in India have developed. There has been rapid modernization and progress, and we've had some beautiful cities that have actually been destroyed by a certain mediocrity of architecture that has overtaken whether the heart of the cities and certainly the suburbs, etc. What can we do to prevent it in Banaras? I'd like you to answer that as well, but your perception.
See, Kishore, and this is a very important point that you're making, because we are going to see in the next 5 decades, India is going to see 500 million people getting into the process of urbanization. 500 million people means that you have to create 2 Americas. There'll be pressure. And therefore, 2 aspects. One is that India must do new urbanization. India needs to create 100 new cities. That's important. Number 2, that, whatever we do in our existing cities, we have to do it to world-class excellence. You're a $4 trillion economy growing last year at 8.2%. You're aiming to be a $30 trillion plus economy when you become 100 in 2047. So whatever you do, there is nothing, you don't need to do anything new. All the things in the world have already been done in the best possible manner. Pick out the world's best practice. Pick out the world's best practice with the best people in the world and replicate that in your cities. Singapore grew in a 750 kilometers from $600 per capita incomes. In 1965, its per capita income was $600. Today, its per capita income is $90,000. What did Lee Kuan Yew do? He didn't innovate. He just copied the world's best practices. And that's what you need to do. The biggest challenge for India is to urbanize sustainably. And sustainability means that you need to have proper drainage, sewage, solid waste. And you need the citizens to become responsible to segregate their waste. Indian citizens are very irresponsible. And Indian municipal governance has totally collapsed. So you need to get these 2 things together.
And Banaras very vitally so.
I have to agree. The importance of this local governance and getting the best practices. And I think for the historic city centres, this is key. You have to deal with issues like water sanitation, plumbage at the top level, the increasing rural to urban migration. I think India has a chance where other countries in the Asian region, let's say, we've seen just the wiping out of the historic cities and massive building. There's a chance, identify those key areas, keep them and work with them and take the best practice. But there is this need. And so, I would have to agree with what's been said. Yeah.
So one last point I want to make is that actually, because a lot of transformation has taken place since Prime Minister became an MP from there, in terms of modernity. And it could have been done in a very reckless manner. So, I mean, in my frequent visits, and including to a village, where a panchayat where I'd worked very closely in terms of improving education and health and nutrition, one thing I find is that even the Vishwanath temple's rejuvenation has been done in a very sensitive manner. The ghats have been done in a very sensitive manner. It could have been ruined, which has been done in a very, very creative and sustainable manner. And that's to the credit of when government gets in, it quite often spoils things, but it's been done in a very, very creative, very sustainable manner.
And that could act as a template for other similar sacred sites? All right, okay. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Amitabh. I'm going to open this out